Hello everyone, my name is Caitlin, you call me Miss Caitlin, and today we are discussing Annie Kenney and the Suffragettes. Before we get started, I just want to go over some class rules and expectations. So you are more than welcome to participate, however, when you are not speaking, please make sure that your mic is muted to keep from unnecessary background noise. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat or just wave me down. And I'll try to see it. So let's talk about this picture here. Let me get this out. See, so right here, this is Annie Kenney, and this is Christabel Pankhurst, which are pretty much going to be the two main characters of this discussion. So let me erase that. Okay, so these are kind of our icebreaker topics. We're going to talk about the location of our topics, where are we talking about, talk about the time period of our topic, and then we're going to answer the questions, what is suffrage and what is militancy, because that is important to understand before we really dive into this topic. So where are we talking about? Where do you think that Annie Kenney and the Suffragettes would be happening in? If you said Europe, you are correct. But where in Europe are we talking about? Let me see if I can, let me highlight where we're talking about here. So we are talking about London mainly, and we also will be talking about Paris a little bit, but we're mainly talking about the UK here in Paris. Okay, so here we are. Here's the UK. Here's a microscopic view of the UK. So when are we talking about? We are talking about the early 1900s or the early 20th century. This picture here is of, once again, we have Christabel here, who I said we were going to be discussing all, and this is Christabel's mother, Mrs. Pankhurst, which she is very important in this movement. She was the original leader of the suffragettes. Okay, so what is suffrage? Let's talk about what suffrage is. So suffrage is the right to vote in political elections. And in this case, we were talking specifically about women's suffrage, so women's right to vote. And here we have a little pin that they would wear that said votes for women. So what is militancy? Militancy is the use of confrontational or violent methods in support of a political or social cause. So we're going to kind of discuss some of the militant methods that the suffragettes used. So here are kind of the meat of our discussion today with these objectives. So the first one is, why did women want the right to vote? Who were the suffragettes? Who was Annie Kenney? And what is the significance of Annie Kenney's role in the suffragette movement? So we're going to go over some historians' work on Annie Kenney in relation to her participation in the suffragette movement. So first, let's talk about, why did women want the right to vote? The first one is, women who pay taxes should have the right to vote. Have you ever heard the saying, no taxation without representation? founding fathers of the United States, said this all through the Revolutionary War, said, um, you can't tax us because we are not being represented in government. And so women of this time in the UK believed that they were paying taxes just like men, but they did not have representation in government. They did not have the right to vote, to have a say in what happened. The second one is legal protection when it comes to custody of children. Um, by default, men were given custody of children in the case of divorce and separation. So normally, by default, men would get custody over the kids, and women didn't have a whole lot of legal recourse when it came to custody of their children. The father could just take the kids, and the mom could not really do much about it. Also, protection for workers. This is what the working class members of the suffrage movement are going to be advocating for. They're going to be advocating for better wages, better working conditions, and things like that. Okay, so there are the Pankhurst. It's very important to know who they were because the suffragette movement came from these three women. Of course, the Pankhurst, there was more of them, but it's these three women in particular that really made a difference here. So we have Mrs. Pankhurst, who we talked about earlier. So her name is actually Emmeline Pankhurst, but she is known as Mrs. Pankhurst in most writings about her. She was always referred to as Mrs. Pankhurst, which that can kind of show the changing of things because in Mrs. Pankhurst's generation, women would always take the name of their husband. So she was Mrs. Pankhurst. Whereas her two daughters here, they never married. So they went by their first names. Christabel here, and then we have Sylvia here. So they went by their first name, Christabel and Sylvia. So when I say Mrs. Pankhurst, I'm going to be talking about the mother here. This is also another picture of her. And then when I say Christabel, here's who we're talking about, and then Sylvia. And remember, they are all one family. Okay, so who were the suffragettes? So obviously they believed in women's suffrage. In 1903, they formed a group called the Women's Social and Political Union. Throughout this lesson, I will be referring to this group as the WSPU. So just remember that when I say the WSPU, I'm talking about the Women's Social and Political Union. And it was led by the Pankhursts, of course. And this group was different from other suffrage groups at the time because they believed in militancy in order to get the right to vote. And this kind of happened because the WSPU had a really hard time getting support from political parties. So just like in the United States, how we have the two major political parties, we have Republicans and Democrats. At this time in the UK, they had the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And the WSPU really could not get support from the Conservative Party or the Labour Party. So the Conservative Party, many of them did not support women having the right to vote. Whereas on the Labour Party side, they did think that women should have the right to vote, but they wanted all women to have the right to vote as well as all men, which is what was called adult suffrage. Adult suffrage would give everyone the right to vote despite their class. At this time, the suffragettes were kind of moving toward a lost my train of thought. The suffragettes were moving toward the idea that men who pay taxes have the right to vote, so women who pay taxes and own property should have the right to vote as well, because men who pay taxes and own property already have the right to vote. And so they kind of saw it like it should be an equal playing field there. But the Labor Party wanted to take it one step further and say we should just give all adults suffrage. So let's talk about Philip Snowden. He was a lecturer for the Labor Party, and he later on became a member of Parliament. So he spoke out against this first draft of the enfranchise for women because it did not include all women. It was only specific to wealthy women. So let's start. Christabel Pankhurst resented his opposition, and she believed that although wealthy women would receive the vote first, that it was a necessary step towards women's suffrage. So she was saying, yeah, I understand that, you know, right now we're only advocating for wealthy women to have the right to vote. However, it's the first necessary step in order for all women to have the right to vote. And Christabel also felt threatened that her opponents were trying to add adult suffrage to the movement because it was unpopular. And if it was unpopular, of course, it wouldn't pass. So she felt that they were just trying to add it on there to take away the chance that any woman would be allowed to vote. She was even warned by some members of Parliament that expansion of the bill to include adult suffrage would result in the automatic decline of the bill's support. So in 1905, this enfranchisement bill was presented in front of Parliament. Henry Lobashire, which is a conservative member of Parliament, he claimed that women, quote, were certainly inferior intellectually to men. And his reasons were that, quote, women were nervous, emotional, and had very little sense of proportion. So when Lobashire's speech came to an end, he had talked the whole time. And there was not left any time for anyone in support of the bill to have a chance to speak. So obviously this angered the suffragettes. They believed that they were not being taken seriously, and that, you know, they just so easily dismissed this bill without even hearing their side of the argument. And as we talked about, the Labor Party was also divided on this issue because they did not believe in partial enfranchisement. So they did not believe that only women, taxpayers and property owners should have the right to vote, and that other women would not get the right to vote. They did not agree because it left working class women out. So by 1906, the suffragettes really didn't have any support by a major political party. And so this is kind of when they, in these years, was kind of when they began really picking up their militancy. It was in the year 1905, 1906. They started doing kind of their first militant actions, which we'll talk about these tactics here in a second. I just want to point out that their frustration with not having support from a political party, it really, it made them go into these militant tactics. They were saying, they're not taking us seriously, so we're going to make them take us seriously. And here we have conservatives on the end that, they did not think that women should have the right to vote at all because women were too emotional, as Lobashir said. And so here we're going to see that this militancy that these suffragettes participated in might actually have backfired on them a little bit, because these conservatives, they already think that women are too emotional to be in politics. So when they see these women acting out, as they say, and throwing rocks through windows, as we will see, and then later they're going to be setting things on fire, it was really used as ammunition against women's suffrage. People like Lobashir could say, see, I told you that they were too emotional. So we're also going to talk about how they were imprisoned for their militancy, and also how they were the subject of police brutality and force feeding. So let's talk about who was Annie Kenney. So she was born in 1879. She was one of 11 children. And she started working in a factory at the age of 10. In 1905, her mother, who she was very close to, passed away. And it wasn't long after her mother passed away that she had met Christabel Pankhurst. And she began her militancy in 1905, the same year that her mother passed away. So her first taste of activism was going to the Free Trade Hall and interrupting the speaker with questions about giving votes to women. So basically what these women would do, these suffragettes would do, they would go to these political rallies, these political meetings, and they would just become loud and kind of interrupt and kind of just be yelling about women's suffrage. Like, have you heard of women's suffrage? Have you heard of women's suffrage? Have you heard of women's suffrage? And so obviously this kind of behavior was not acceptable at the time, and so they were arrested. And Annie Kenney and Christabel were actually sentenced to 3 days imprisonment for this. And they could have paid a fine and not had to serve their 3 days in prison. But Christabel wanted as much publicity as possible, so they sat in prison for 3 days. So let's talk about Kenney as a recruiter. Christabel, because Annie Kenney was a working class woman, Christabel wanted to use her to encourage other working class women to join the movement. And she became a key player in influencing working class women of London to join in the militancy, alongside Sylvia Pankhurst, which we talked about earlier, and Teresa Billington, who we will mention again later. So both of these women, Sylvia and Billington, both of whom later rejected the WSPU for abandoning the working class. So that is important to note for later. So as a recruiter, Kenney, she really painted this kind of perfect narrative of what women winning the right to vote would be like. She said, she made the claim that poverty would be practically swept away. She said, in fact, paradise would be there once the vote was won. So she really believed that paradise would be here if women had the right to vote, and that all their problems would basically be swept away. And I think that she fully believed these things that she told these women at the time. Obviously, when she was writing her memoir, she kind of pointed out how silly it was that she had claimed these things at the time. But, at the time, looking back, she kind of saw that, you were, pretty extreme claims to make about, women getting the right to vote. However, at the time, she really believed it. And it could be because, maybe these were the things that she was being told to get her involved as well. Um, so it's also important to note that Kenney was in a vulnerable state when she joined the WSPU. She had just lost her mother, and in her memoir, she talks about how she was desperate to find meaning in her life, and she really believed that the meaning in her life that she found it through the WSPU and through the fight for women's suffrage. And through through the split in the suffragette movement, which we will talk about in a later slide, Annie Kenney stayed stayed loyal to Christabel through the entire thing. Even as the movement began to shift away from working class women to a more aristocratic women, to more wealthy women in the movement, um, but Annie Kenney was always very aware of the need to employ working class women. In her memoir, she wrote, quote, poor oppressed, unawakened East Enders, which East Enders are going to be those working class women that live in the East End of London. The East End of London is where the factories are located, and it's where most of the working class individuals lived. So she said, poor oppressed, unawakened East Enders, every farmer using them for his own means, and we were doing just the same. So I don't know if that was maybe a little indicator that she understood that maybe they used the working class women. Um, so let's talk about this other quote that she said. She said, poor East End women, we gave them something to dream about and a hope in the future, however distant it might be. So she's admitting to the fact that they made promises to these women um, that maybe they were unable to keep. They made promises to these working class women that um, they were not able to keep. And she said, however distant it might be, which once women did receive the right to vote in the UK, it was only those women who were taxpayers and property owners. So the working class women were excluded from the first bill that allowed women to vote in the UK. So I think maybe she's making a reference to that where she says, however distant it might be. Here's this picture here. This is Constance Linton. She is a very wealthy woman, and here's her right next to Kenney. And here in a second, we're going to talk about her involvement in the suffrage movement, or in the suffragette movement. Let's talk about Kenney's second arrest. So Kenney was chosen to go to the Prime Minister Acquit's house unannounced. So this was another militant tactic that they used. They would go to these politicians' houses unannounced and kind of knock on their door and just bombard them with questions about why don't you support women's suffrage and things like that. So after she rang the doorbell, the police were called. She was labeled as the leader of the group. And so she was sentenced to 2 months in prison. And here's what she had to say about prison during this time. She said, "In prison, you honestly feel that you might be forgotten, and the feeling is very real, and the picture of the results of such a mistake most vivid." And here is another quote that she wrote about what it was like in this militancy movement. She wrote, "In a militant movement, those who are the militant ones always regard any action on the part of their opponents as bad tactics from the opponent's point of view. We gained power with each blow given. Cabinet ministers got so harassed at these constant attacks and so nervous about the suffragettes that a bill was introduced called the Public Meetings Bill, which was to protect them against us. Bills are futile against revolution." So she's basically saying that by them passing this bill, the suffragettes are actually gaining more power. The more that they fear the suffragettes, militant actions, the more power that they gain from it. So in 1909, they began a hunger strike. So with every militant action, more suffragettes were sentenced to prison. And they adopted the motto, "Release or death." So that means release us from prison, or essentially they were going to starve themselves. So they would not eat while they were in prison as an act of protest. So in response to this, the government either would release the suffragettes early, and then once they were recovered, they would rearrest them, or they would force feed them. And here's a picture right here of Mrs. Pankhurst after she had went through a hunger strike. She almost died from hunger strike. So let's talk about force feeding. This is a very painful experience that these women went through. Very demeaning thing to go through. So as you would see, they would have to hold the woman down. Sometimes it looks like they tie up their legs. It takes several people because, this woman obviously doesn't want to be force fed, so she would fight back. So they would have to really constrain her. And then you can see here, let me get my pen. You can see here, he's pouring some kind of liquid mixture of food, and it goes down this tube. So they would shove this tube I believe it was shoved in the nose. So can you just imagine having these tubes, shoved into your nose? That's very painful, and then they just kind of shoot this food through it. I mean, it's very, and then at the same time, you're fighting and you have all these people holding you down. It had to be a very traumatic experience. So force feeding in prisons really showed the differences between the classes of women. Upper class woman, Lady Constance Linton, who we saw a picture of earlier, she was not force fed, while working class women were. And she even wrote a letter about the unfair treatment of working class prisoners. She said, "Those of us who had influential friends have been treated with comparative leniency, whereas working class women have the harshest treatment." So in 1912, they began what is known as extreme militancy. So this is when they began throwing stones through public buildings or through private residences of politicians. So they were obviously being arrested for these property violations. And while this was happening, Christabel had fled to Paris. She was just gone because the police were looking for her. You know, she is the mastermind behind this. So the police are looking for her. And so she flees to Paris. And Annie Kenney actually receives a letter from Christabel from Paris. And so she actually goes to Paris to meet her. So it was during this time away in Paris that Christabel devised a plan to commit arson. If you don't know what arson is, it is the criminal act of deliberately setting fire to property. So what they would do is they would set fire to people's residences. So here's what Annie Kenney said about that. She said, "We did risk human lives when we burnt houses, in spite of the care we took to see all buildings were unattended. But Providence protected us. No life was lost except on the militant side. Many militants are, in fact, in today lying on sick beds, suffering from the after effects of imprisonments and forced feeding." So she's saying, you know, look, no one was hurt by these actions other than, you know, the suffragettes that were carrying out these actions and then being imprisoned and force fed. So here's a picture of one of the houses that had burnt as a result of the suffragettes. And here's a quote from Annie Kenney. She said, "Wars and revolution have their tragic side, and our revolution was no exception to the rule. There were those who worked unceasingly and in the end were forgotten, lost sight amidst the toil and strife. Extreme militancy brought with it tragedy and suffering, heartache and loneliness. Was it worth the trouble, the sacrifices made, the suffering endured? To me, it was worth it all. And I believe extreme militancy was necessary." So let's talk about the split in the WSPU. So there was a dispute between the two sisters, Christabel and Sylvia. So Sylvia had begun in 1912 working with the East London Federation, or as we will call it, the ELF. So at first it was a part of the WSPU. It was just their East End of London group, their working class group of the WSPU. Sylvia wrote about how she wanted more working class women to be a part of the movement. She wrote, "I wanted to rouse the women of the submerged mass to be not merely the argument of more fortunate people, but to be fighters on their own account, despising mere platitudes and catch cries, revolting against the hideous conditions about them, and demanding for themselves and their families a full share of the benefits of civilization and progress." So this is where the dispute between Christabel and Sylvia begins. Because as Sylvia is working in the East End with the ELF, they begin to distinguish themselves from the WSPU. For example, they did not agree with the arson campaign. They did not agree with setting these people's homes on fire. They also were very strongly advocating for adult suffrage, which, as we already discussed, Christabel and the WSPU did not advocate for adult suffrage. So here Sylvia is with this group called the ELF that was advocating for adult suffrage. They were not in support of the arson campaign, and they also had worked with men's working class groups as well. And this was something that Christabel had an issue with. She actually mentioned it in the article that they had called the Suffragette. She said that the WSPU will not be associated with men's parties or movements. So, and she wrote this after she had seen that her sister Sylvia had been involved with the Daily Herald League, which was a men's group in support of adult suffrage. So Sylvia denied the claims that she had allied the ELF with the Daily Herald League and insisted that she was still working toward votes for women. Christabel believed that Sylvia was working against the movement and told her that the WSPU would not support her as it may cause a rift in the movement. The sisters' disagreement finally came to a head in 1914. Mrs. Pankhurst and Christabel summoned Sylvia to Paris. So at this time, they're still in Paris in hiding. So Sylvia arrives in Paris, and Christabel lets her know that the ELF, they're not welcome in the WSPU anymore. And Sylvia is pretty upset about this. She's trying to reason with her sister Christabel. She said, you can't, make us leave the WSPU because it will cause division between classes, between the working class and the upper classes. And you need all these groups of women working together in order to achieve women's suffrage. But Christabel did not like how the ELF was aligning itself with adult suffragists. She believed that it was working against the WSPU's policies. So she asked, what good would the working class do for their cause? And Sylvia actually claims that her sister called working class women the weakest group of women. Sylvia claims that Christabel told her that surely it is a mistake to use the weakest for the struggle. We want picked women, the very strongest and the most intelligent. This is what Sylvia claims that Christabel has said. In Christabel's memoir, she makes no mention of this discussion or the claims that Sylvia had made against her. So unfortunately, we'll never know her side of the story. We only know what Sylvia had said. So Sylvia basically believes that Christabel abandoned working class women. And that's the quote that she uses to support that. Like, she told me that they were the weakest and that we want picked women. So when Sylvia returned to London, the WSPU and the ELF were pretty much separated at that point. And Sylvia felt that Christabel's time away in Paris had made her disconnected from the movement. And they actually furthered their disagreement. They brought their disagreements to public. Sylvia wrote in the Women's Dreadnought, she wrote, quote, some people tell us that it is neither especially important that working women should agitate for the vote, nor especially important that they should have it. They forget that comparatively the leisured, comfortably situated women are but a little group, but the working women a multitude. So these words seem to be aimed toward Sylvia's mother and sister. Like, basically, have you forgotten where the numbers are? Because working women, the group of working women are a multitude. And Sylvia wasn't alone in her agitation towards the WSPU. As we spoke about Teresa Billington earlier. She also wrote that the working class women and having power appeal to them were either edged out of the movement or stifled long ago. So she's talking about how the WSPU just started pushing these working class women out of the movement. So also, we'll talk about what Kenney said about this, but for one to question the policies of the WSPU was to question the integrity of Christabel. Christabel blamed the failures of the arson campaign on the fact that Sylvia and the ELF had not participated like they were asked. Ultimately, it was Christabel's policies that had alienated Sylvia Pankhurst and her working class followers. So we're going to learn. So Christabel was a very headstrong person. You could not question her policies. To question her policies was to question her as a person and her intelligence as a person. She took it very personally. And I think that Sylvia was a very headstrong person as well. And then both of them being very headstrong and very passionate about what they believe to be right, I think is what ultimately, caused this division, because they were not able to compromise. So here's what Kenney said on the separation. She said, "It was quite obvious to me that opinions were changing, that they were not the absolute implicit faith that had existed in the earlier days. To question policy with Christabel meant everything. Once people questioned policy, her whole feeling changed towards them." So here we go again, you could not question Christabel and her policies. So she also went on to say, the decision was a difficult one to make. Whichever side I took, I knew I would bruise or hurt the side I had left. Had I thought they would just be angry, I should have not cared half so much. The choice had to be made. The only thing I could do was ask my higher self what I should do. The message was clear: follow Christabel. Against this, I can make no appeal. So she chooses to work with Christabel during the separation. So as we talked about earlier, the vote was not won in 1912. They had been promised that women's suffrage would be in this 1912 bill, and it did not get passed. So the arson increased as a response, and Kenney was arrested once more and put on trial. During these, years between 1912 and 1914, Kenney was in and out of prison, essentially. She would go to prison. She would not eat. She would go on a hunger strike. They would release her from prison. Then after she would recover, they would rearrest her, and she would go back to prison. One of the times she decided to also go on a thirst strike, and she was in such bad condition after that that she actually had to be carried out of prison at the time that she was released. So after the World War I began, Christabel instructed Annie Kenney to go to the United States to help the American suffragettes. So she traveled, while she was in the United States, she actually traveled across the states making speeches in support of women's suffrage. So let's talk about the legacy of Annie Kenney. Let's talk about what historians have said about her. Let's talk about R.S. Neal. He wrote in the 1960s, he made an article about the suffragettes and working class women. And he uses Annie Kenney as an example of the WSPU's exploitation of working class women. He argued that she was a perfect commodity because she was working class and did what she was told. He painted Annie Kenney as weak-minded and being a blind follower, Christabel Pankhurst. And this assertion is based on the fact that Annie Kenney never publicly disagreed with Christabel. As she wrote in her book, you couldn't, to question Christabel's policy was to question Christabel as a person. And so, of course, she would not publicly disagree with her policies, knowing how Christabel was. And also, Sylvia described Annie Kenney as being a blind follower of Christabel. Obviously, we know that Sylvia had an agenda. She had felt that the WSPU had just abandoned the working class. And so because Annie Kenney was a working class woman herself, she just had to say, yeah, well, she was exploited by Christabel. And she was just a blind follower of her. But I think that it's unfair to assume that Annie Kenney was not an individual with her own ideas, just because she never publicly spoke out against Christabel. One journalist, Fran Abrams, actually challenged this idea that Annie Kenney was just a blind follower that never disagreed with Christabel. She thinks that Annie may have expressed concerns to Christabel about how the movement was shifting more towards wealthy women. Because not too soon, after the war had broken out, she was sent to the United States by Christabel. And so this journalist, Fran Abrams, actually suspects that the reason she was sent to the United States was to kind of get her away because she was starting to question Christabel. Also, historian Martin Pugh, he claimed that Annie Kenney mainly worked independently. So this would also conflict with the idea that Annie Kenney was a blind follower of Christabel Pankhurst. And in 2015, the statue of Annie Kenney was built in London, or in Manchester, I think. They built this to honor her and her fight in the suffrage movement. So now I'll pass it over to you. What do you think? Based on what you know of Annie Kenney, and this is one of those historical questions that is still not answered, and maybe it won't be fully answered about Annie Kenney's role in the suffragette movement, and her relation with Christabel, and how she felt about the movement. Obviously, we know that she felt very strongly about militancy. She really believed in the power of militancy. And we also know that she chose Christabel over, the division. She was obviously very loyal to Christabel. So let me know your thoughts on this, because it's very important to kind of understand the historical debate that's surrounding this influential person that was Annie Kenney. So thank you guys so much for watching my lesson. Um, and just let me know what you think.